The air in containment cell 734 tasted of recycled oxygen and the faint, antiseptic tang of nutrient paste. It was a taste Elian had known for 2,467 days. He counted them. He counted the breaths between the automated chimes that signaled the start of a new cycle, the precise number of steps it took to cross the sterile white floor, the cycles of the luminescent panels in the ceiling that mimicked a day he could no longer clearly remember. The mimicry was an insult, a pale, flat imitation of sunlight that offered no warmth, only a cold, pervasive illumination that left no corner in shadow. There was nowhere to hide. Not from the silent, recessed camera in the corner, a single black eye in a sea of white. Not from the bioscanners embedded in the floor that monitored his heart rate, his respiration, his hormonal fluctuations. And certainly not from himself. His scent was a ghost. A carefully managed, systematically suppressed phantom that was only permitted to exist within the confines of his own skin. The daily regimen of suppressants was a ritual of erasure. A cool gel applied to his wrists, the back of his neck, the soft skin behind his ears, the places where his essence was strongest. It felt like being painted with nothingness. The active agents leached into his bloodstream, muting the delicate notes of rain-soaked earth and wild freesia that the genetic arbiters had deemed his signature. They called it a volatility, a flaw, a scent too evocative, too organic for the sterile order of the core. He was an anomaly, a throwback to a time before control was perfected. He was not an asset, he was an experiment, a problem to be managed. Today was different. A subtle shift in the sterile air, a change in the pressure that made the fine hairs on his arms stand on end. They were coming. The anticipation was not excitement, but a cold, familiar dread that settled deep in his gut. It was the anniversary, the 5th anniversary of the concordance, the day his life had fractured, the day he had been presented, catalogued, and ultimately discarded. The memory was a shard of glass under his skin, a pain that was always present but only throbbed when pressed. He could still feel the vastness of the presentation hall, the weight of 1,000 silent stairs. He could still see the Alpha. His name was a whisper of static in Elian's mind, a name he was forbidden to speak, a name logged in his file only as Enforcer Commander Kalen. He had stood on the dais, a figure carved from granite and shadow, his uniform a stark black against the hall's oppressive white. He was the pinnacle of the Core's design, a perfect alpha, his genetics flawless, his control absolute. And he was Elian's. The bond had snapped into place with the force of a physical blow, a searing, undeniable connection that lit up every nerve in Elian's body. He had smelled him then, for the first and only time without filters or suppressants. Ozone after a lightning strike, cold, clean, and utterly dominant. It was the scent of power, the scent of his ruin. Elian closed his eyes, pressing his palms against the cool, seamless wall. The memory of the Alpha's voice was worse than the memory of his face. It had been low, measured, and devoid of any emotion as he spoke the words that had become the defining sentence of Elian's existence. I reject this pairing. The asset is unstable. Its scent profile indicates a high probability of emotional contagion. It is flawed. Flawed. The word had echoed in the cavernous silence. Not a person, an asset, an it. The bond, so bright and new, had withered into something cold and toxic, a chain that connected them, not in union, but in shared disgrace. His disgrace. Kalen's judgment. A low hiss signaled the cycling of the air vent, and with it came something new. Faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Ozone. The cold, sharp scent of an impending storm. Elian's breath hitched. It was impossible. The filtration systems were absolute. No unsanctioned scents were permitted in the containment wing. It was a rule as fundamental as gravity. Yet it was there, a ghost of a scent threading its way through the sterile air, seeking him out. His heart began to hammer against his ribs, a frantic, panicked rhythm that the floor sensors would undoubtedly register. The monitors in the observation room would be flashing red. An anomaly, a deviation from the baseline. He was always a deviation. He pushed himself away from the wall, moving to the center of the room. He held his breath, trying to isolate the source, to understand the breach. Was it a test? Another psychological experiment designed to measure his reaction, to catalogue his weakness? Or was it real? Was he the Enforcer commander somewhere nearby? The thought was a violation, a trespass against the sterile peace of his confinement. The cell was his prison, but it was also his sanctuary from the man who had broken him. The scent grew stronger, a subtle, invasive presence that wrapped around him like a shroud. It wasn't just ozone now, it was more complex. There was a note of something dark and metallic, like fresh blood, and something else, something deeply unsettling, a raw, desperate hunger. It was the scent of an alpha losing control, the scent of the perfect Enforcer commander unraveling. A bitter, ironic smile touched Elian's lips. It was a humorless expression, a twitch of muscle that felt foreign on his face. So, the flawless alpha had a flaw of his own, and it smelled just like him. Elian inhaled slowly, deliberately, drawing the impossible scent deep into his lungs. It felt like breathing for the first time in 5 years. It felt like poison. It felt like power. The luminescent panels above flickered once, twice, and then held steady, casting his long, thin shadow on the pristine, white floor. The shadow trembled. From the darkened observation gallery, Enforcer Commander Kalen watched the Omega. The one-way chromaglass rendered him invisible, a ghost in the machine, which was precisely how he preferred it. Control was maintained through distance, through objectivity. Emotion was a variable that corrupted data, and the Omega in Cell 734 was a nexus of corrupting variables. His file designated him Asset 1138, but Kalen knew his name. Elian. The name was a burr, caught in the clinical machinery of his mind. He accessed the real-time biometric feed on the datapad, fused to his wrist. Heart rate, 112 BPM. Respiration, elevated. Dermal galvanic response, spiking. The asset was agitated. Kalen adjusted the environmental controls for the gallery, lowering the temperature by a single degree. The cold helped him think. It sharpened the edges of his focus, which had been blurring lately. He had not been down to the containment wing in over a year. His duties were strategic, overseeing the city's security grid, quelling dissent in the outer zones, ensuring the seamless function of the core. He was an architect of order. He had no business observing a failed Omega, a relic of a past he had personally and publicly disavowed. Yet here he was, the 5th anniversary of the Concordance. The date was flagged in his private chronometer, a stark red reminder he could not delete. It was a loose thread in the perfect tapestry of his life, and his nature abhorred loose threads. He had come to review the assets file to ensure its continued containment was still a necessary allocation of resources. That was the official reason he logged. The truth was a more complicated, more visceral thing. He could smell him. Even here, 3 layers of reinforced plasteel and a sophisticated atmospheric buffer away, he could smell him. It was a faint, maddening trace, a phantom on the edge of his senses that had been growing more persistent for months. Rain-soaked earth and a flower he couldn't name. It clung to the inside of his uniform. It haunted the sterile air of his apartment. It was there when he closed his eyes at night. His personal medicabot had diagnosed it as an olfactory hallucination, a symptom of stress. Kalen knew better. It was a memory with teeth. His mind replayed the concordance, not as a strategic decision, but as a moment of catastrophic failure. He remembered the moment Elian had stepped onto the dais. The Omega had been thin, almost fragile, but his eyes held a defiant spark that the core's conditioning had not managed to extinguish. And his scent. Gods, his scent! It had hit Kalen with the force of a plasma blast, bypassing his training, his discipline, his iron-clad control. It was the scent of everything the core had sought to eradicate. Wildness, chaos, untamed nature. It was the scent of his fated mate. For one terrifying second, his alpha instincts had roared to the surface, a primal urge to claim, to mark, to possess. It was the most profound loss of control he had ever experienced. So he had done the only thing he could. He had severed it. He had used the cold, precise language of his station to perform a vivisection on his own soul. I reject this pairing. The words had been a shield, a weapon. He had seen the light in Elian's eyes die. He had felt the bond stretch, thin, and turn toxic. It had not broken. The ideologues claimed rejection shattered the bond. They were wrong. It had simply inverted, becoming a conduit not for connection, but for a constant, low-grade agony. A phantom limb that ached with the memory of what it was supposed to hold. He had sacrificed the Omega to preserve his own integrity, to uphold the principles of the core. It was a necessary cruelty. Duty was the highest form of honor. He repeated the mantra to himself, but the words felt hollow, worn smooth with overuse. He watched Elian on the monitor. The Omega was standing perfectly still, his head tilted as if listening to something no one else could hear. Kalen zoomed the camera in, focusing on his face. The defiance he remembered was still there, but it was quieter now, banked like embers under a layer of ash. There was a profound loneliness in his posture that had not been there 5 years ago, a product of the isolation Kalen himself had sentenced him to. An unexpected and unwelcome pang of something that felt dangerously like guilt resonated in his chest. He dismissed it as a physiological anomaly. He had made a mistake today. Before coming to the gallery, he had visited the evidence locker where the Omega's personal effects from the outer zones were stored. A few worn books, a small carved wooden bird, a rough-spun tunic. He had picked up the tunic. He had told himself he was checking for contraband biomarkers. He had lied. He had raised the fabric to his face and inhaled. The scent, though faded, was there. Earth and flowers. And for a moment, the ghost in his mind had become real. A small amount of the scent particles must have clung to his uniform. That was the only logical explanation for the breach. A minuscule, insignificant contamination. But it had been enough to cross the buffers, to find its way through the vents, to reach the one person in the entire city engineered to respond to it. He had inadvertently sent his own scent, tainted with a desperate memory of Elian's, directly into his cell. A catastrophic, unforgivable breach of protocol, a failure of control. He watched the Omega on the screen inhale, a long, slow breath, and Kalen felt a mirror sensation in his own lungs, a desperate ache for a scent he had spent 5 years trying to forget. The datapad on his wrist flashed with a new alert. Asset 1138's endorphin levels were rising. He was not reacting with fear. He was reacting with something else, something Kalen could not quantify. A cold dread, far more potent than guilt, settled in Kalen's stomach. He had not just sent a scent, he had sent a signal. And in the silent, sterile world of Cell 734, the Omega had just received it. The days that followed the scent incident bled into one another, each marked by the same sterile routine, yet fundamentally altered. The ghost of ozone and hunger lingered, not in the air but in Elian's memory, a new data point in the monotonous equation of his existence. The system had reacted, of course. Within an hour of the breach, a sanitation crew in full biohazard suits had scoured his cell, purging the air with a chemical agent that smelled of bitter citrus and left a film on his skin. They had drawn his blood, run diagnostics, and a grim-faced proctor had observed him through the chromaglass for 12 straight hours. They found nothing, because the change was not in the cell or in his blood. It was in him. The incident had been a stone thrown into the still, stagnant pond of his despair, and the ripples were spreading. He began to test the boundaries of his confinement in ways he never had before. Small rebellions that were invisible to the ever-watching eye of the camera. He learned to control his breathing, to keep it even and slow even when his heart was pounding, denying the bioscanners their data. He would meditate, focusing on the memory of the scent, dissecting it, learning its components, ozone, metal, and that dark, raw need. He held it in his mind, turning it over and over, and in doing so he found he could summon a ghost of his own scent in response. He could will the faint fragrance of freesia to bloom just under his skin, a whisper too faint for the room's senses, but achingly real to him. It was a muscle he had not known he possessed. The suppressants muted the signal, but they did not destroy the source. He was not erased, he was merely dormant. His only human contact was with Anya, a junior medic who administered his weekly nutrient infusions. She was young, her face not yet hardened into the impassive mask of the other core functionaries. She had kind eyes that did not look at him like a specimen in a jar. During one of her visits, while the infusion pump hummed its steady rhythm, Elian deviated from their usual script of silence. "The air filters," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "They registered a contamination last week. Do you know what it was?" Anya froze, her hands hovering over the control panel. Talking to the assets beyond procedural necessities was forbidden. "I am not privy to that information," she said, her voice tight, formal. Elian held her gaze. He did not press, did not demand. He simply watched her, letting the silence stretch. He let a flicker of the desperate loneliness he felt show in his eyes. He had learned that the system's functionaries were conditioned to resist aggression, but they were often disarmed by vulnerability. It was a variable they were not trained to compute. Anya's gaze faltered. She glanced nervously toward the camera, then back at him. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a near inaudible whisper. "It was an alpha scent. Unidentified. They purged the records. It's like it never happened." She straightened up, her professional mask back in place, and finished her work in silence. But she had given him everything. An alpha scent, unidentified. They had lied. They had covered it up. And if they were covering it up, it meant it was important. It meant it was a mistake. It meant Kalen, the perfect enforcer commander, was not as perfect as his masters believed. The knowledge was a key, turning a lock in his mind. He began to push further. He started subtly manipulating his own bio-readings, creating minute, meaningless fluctuations that would trigger low-level alerts in the monitoring station. A slightly elevated heart rate here, a fractional drop in body temperature there. He became a nuisance of data, a stream of static that required constant analysis and recalibration. He was forcing them to pay attention to him, not as a dormant experiment, but as an active problem. He wanted to be seen. He wanted to understand the machine that held him, and the only way to do that was to see how it reacted when he poked it. During one of Anya's subsequent visits, he took another risk. As she was detaching the infusion line, he focused his will, summoning that ghost of his own scent, pushing it out from his skin with a desperation born of 5 years of nothingness. It was a fragile, fleeting thing, the scent of crushed flowers after a storm. Anya stopped, her knuckles brushing his arm. She inhaled sharply, a tiny, involuntary gasp. Her eyes widened, darting around the cell as if searching for the source. She looked at him, a question dawning on her face. "The suppressants," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. "They are not as absolute as they think." Fear warred with a nascent curiosity in her expression. She quickly finished her task and left without a word. But the next week she returned, and as she worked, she surreptitiously slid a microdata chip, no bigger than her thumbnail, into the palm of his hand. It was warm from her skin. "Be careful," she whispered, her back to the camera. "It's encrypted, but it's your file, the full one, the parts they redacted." He closed his hand around the chip, the smooth metal cool against his skin. It felt heavier than a star. That night, under the cold, artificial moonlight of the cell's sleep cycle, he worked. The cell's terminal was locked, but the nutrient dispenser had a diagnostic port. It was a long shot, a desperate hope. He spent hours coaxing the simple machine, using its limited interface to slice through the chip's encryption. It was like trying to pick a citadel lock with a piece of straw, but he had nothing but time, and then he was in. The screen glowed with text, lines and lines of clinical, detached analysis of his own biology, his psychology, his entire existence. He scrolled past the familiar data, the scent profiles, the concordance report. He went to the redacted sections, and he found it. This reason for his flaw. It was a genetic marker, a recessive trait from his outer zone ancestry. A trait the Corps had been systematically trying to breed out for generations. It wasn't a volatility. It was a sensitivity, an empathic connection linked directly to his olfactory senses. He could not only produce a scent, he could read the scents of others on a level most Omegas couldn't comprehend. He could taste their emotions, their fear, their desire, their lies. He was not flawed. He was a truth serum, a lie detector. In a society built on control and emotional repression, he was a walking, breathing, existential threat. The rejection wasn't about his unstable scent. It was about his terrifying clarity. Kalen hadn't just rejected a mate. He had rejected a mirror that would have shown him everything he was hiding from himself. The cell was not just a prison to contain a failed Omega. It was a vault designed to contain a truth so potent it could destabilize their entire social order. He was not an experiment. He was a weapon they were terrified to let anyone wield. A wave of cold, exhilarating fury washed over him. The bitterness of his abandonment was still there, but it was now tempered with something new, a purpose. They had locked him in a cage to keep him from understanding his own power, and in doing so, they had given him nothing else to do but exactly that. The camera in the corner watched on, a blind god, oblivious to the revolution that had just begun in the silent white room. Kalen's apartment was a monument to order. Polished chrome, black granite, and controlled lighting. It was a space devoid of personal effects, save for a single, perfectly pruned bonsai tree on his desk, a symbol of nature tamed, disciplined, and bent to an aesthetic will. It was his sanctuary from the chaos of the city, a place where every variable was under his direct control. But his control was failing. The phantom scent was no longer a phantom. It was a presence. It saturated the recycled air, a constant low thrum of rain-soaked earth and wild freesia that was driving him to the edge of his sanity. He had the air scrubbers working on maximum, cycling the atmosphere every 10 minutes. But it did no good. The scent was not in the air. It was in him. His obsession had become a ritual. Each night, after his duties were complete, he would lock himself in his study and pull up the surveillance feeds from cell 734. He would watch the Omega for hours. He watched him sleep, his breathing a slow, steady rhythm in the silent room. He watched him exercise, a series of fluid, disciplined movements that spoke of a resilience Kalen found both admirable and deeply unsettling. He watched him eat the bland nutrient paste, his expression unreadable. He told himself it was tactical surveillance. Asset 1138 had shown anomalous bio-readings. It was his duty as Enforcer Commander to monitor a potential threat. It was a lie, and he knew it. This was not duty, it was a desperate, gnawing hunger. He was a starving man, watching footage of a banquet he had refused. The incident with the scent contamination had fractured his composure. He had personally overseen the data purge, classifying the event as a minor systems malfunction. He had interrogated the sanitation crew himself, his voice cold enough to freeze coolant. No one suspected his involvement. No one could. A mistake of that magnitude would be more than a demerit. It would be a crack in the very foundation of his authority. The Enforcer Commander, the embodiment of alpha control, losing discipline over his own scent? It was unthinkable, treasonous, and yet it had happened, and it was continuing to happen. His own scent had begun to betray him. In moments of high stress, or when his thoughts drifted too long to the Omega, he could smell it on himself, the sharp tang of ozone, but laced with something else now. A note of frustration, of longing. It was a scent of weakness, and it terrified him. He had taken to wearing a low-level scent neutralizer at all times, a discreet patch on his skin that was standard for operatives in the field, but not for a commander at the heart of the Corps. It felt like a brand of shame. The system he had dedicated his life to, a system of perfect order and control, was beginning to feel like a cage of his own making. He saw the flaws he had once ignored. The sterile perfection of the Corps was a brittle thing, a beautiful, elaborate lie built on the suppression of everything that made a person truly alive. He saw it in the blank, placid faces of the functionaries, in the joyless efficiency of the city, in the ruthless culling of any genetic or emotional deviation. He had been its staunchest defender, its most effective tool. Now he felt like its most decorated prisoner. He pulled up a specific file from the archives, the full unredacted report on Asset 1138. The sections on the Omega's unique genetic marker were flagged with the highest security clearance. He had read it before, 5 years ago, before the concordance. He had read it and understood the threat. An empathic sensitivity tied to scent, the ability to perceive the emotional truth behind the carefully constructed facades of the Corps' elite. The Omega was not just a mismatch. He was a political and social explosive. His public rejection had been framed as a necessary act of quality control. The private justification, known only to him and a handful of senior ideologues, was one of containment. He had been chosen to reject Elian precisely because his own control was legendary. He was the only alpha they believed could withstand the Omega's potent scent and the pull of the bond long enough to sever it publicly, making an example of the asset's flaw. He had performed his duty perfectly. He had been their perfect weapon. He stared at the Omega's image on the screen. Elian was sitting on the edge of his cot, his back ramrod straight. He was looking directly at the camera. Kalen felt a jolt, as if the Omega could see him through the lens, through the layers of technology and distance. Elian's expression was calm, but his eyes held a new light. Not the defiant spark of a boy from the outer zones, not the dull resignation of a prisoner. It was the cool, assessing gaze of someone who understood the game, someone who was learning the rules in order to break them. A cold realization washed over Kalen. The anomaly in the bio-readings wasn't a sign of distress or degradation. It was a sign of evolution. While he had been slowly unraveling, trapped in his sterile apartment and haunted by a ghost, the Omega, locked in a white box, had been growing stronger. He had been sharpening a weapon Kalen hadn't even known he possessed. The hunger Kalen felt shifted, mingled with a new and terrifying emotion. Fear. Not fear of the Omega, but fear for him. And fear of what he, in his desperation, might be driven to do next. The obsession was no longer passive. It was becoming an active, dangerous force. He had to see him. He had to confront the source of his undoing. He keyed in a command on his datapad, scheduling an immediate, unsanctioned interrogation of Asset 1138. The reason logged was Security Threat Assessment. The truth was simpler and far more damning. He was losing control. Elian knew he was coming before the door hissed open. The scent of ozone preceded him, stronger and more complex than the ghost that had haunted his cell weeks ago. It was a storm front moving down the corridor, charged with intent. This was not a memory, this was real. He rose from his cot, his movements fluid and deliberate, and stood in the center of the room. He smoothed the front of his plain grey tunic, a meaningless gesture that felt, in the moment, like donning armor. He had spent the last few weeks not just reading his file, but practicing. He had learned to shield his thoughts, to project a false calm in his bio readings, and most importantly, he had learned to modulate the whisper of his own scent. He could not make it strong enough to overcome the suppressants entirely, but he could change its texture, infusing it with specific emotional notes. He was ready for this. The door slid open, and Enforcer Commander Kalen stepped inside. He was just as Elian remembered, yet different. Taller, somehow, more imposing in the confined space of the cell. His black uniform seemed to absorb the light, and his face was a mask of cold authority. But Elian could see the subtle tells, the faint tension in his jaw, the way his eyes, a piercing, glacial grey, swept the room before landing on him, lingering for a fraction of a second too long. And his scent. It filled the small room, an overwhelming presence. The ozone was sharp and clear, the scent of command. But underneath it, Elian could taste the other notes now, the ones he had only glimpsed before. The metallic tang of stress, the dark, musky scent of a deeply suppressed possessiveness, and a profound, aching frustration that was almost suffocating. The perfect alpha was a maelstrom of conflict. Asset 1138. Kalen's voice was a low baritone, as cold and controlled as Elian remembered. It vibrated in the small space. There have been irregularities in your biometric data. I am here to assess the threat you pose to facility security. The formal clinical language was a shield. Elian recognized it for what it was. He did not reply. He simply met Kalen's gaze, his own expression neutral. He let the silence stretch, a weapon he was becoming adept at wielding. In the quiet, the sound of their breathing was unnervingly loud. Kalen took a step closer. The air crackled with the proximity. Your file indicates a history of instability. Kalen continued, his eyes narrowed. A predisposition to emotional contagion. Elian allowed himself a small, slow smile. It did not reach his eyes. My file indicates what you told them to write, Commander. The use of his title was a deliberate choice, a reminder of the chasm between them, a reminder of his power and Elian's lack of it. But Kalen's control flickered. A muscle in his jaw jumped. The scent of frustration in the room intensified. You will answer my questions, Kalen commanded, his voice dropping lower, rougher. The Alpha command was there, a pressure in the air designed to compel obedience from an Omega. Elian felt it, a physical weight on his shoulders, but the broken, toxic bond between them acted as a strange sort of filter. The command was there, but the conviction behind it was not. It was an order hollowed out by the Alpha's own inner turmoil. Elian withstood it. He held his ground. You are not here to ask questions, Commander. You are here because you broke protocol. You contaminated my cell with your scent, and now you cannot forget what you chose to throw away." The truth of the words hit Kalen like a physical blow. He took another involuntary step forward, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. They were only a few feet apart now. Elian could feel the heat radiating from him. The scent was dizzying, a raw, unfiltered broadcast of the Alpha's inner state. The hunger was no longer a subtle undertone. It was a roaring furnace. "You are a security risk," Kalen gritted out, the words sounding forced, rehearsed. "Am I?" Elian tilted his head, his gaze unwavering. "Or am I simply a mirror? The one thing in your perfectly ordered world that shows you the truth?" He took a risk. He focused his will, pushing past the suppressants, and released a single, targeted note of his own scent. It was not the full, wild fragrance of his nature, but a carefully curated echo of it. The scent of rain-soaked earth. The scent Kalen had been hallucinating for months. Kalen flinched as if struck. His eyes widened, the pupils dilating. He inhaled sharply, a ragged, desperate sound. The mask of the Enforcer commander shattered, replaced by the raw, unguarded face of an Alpha confronted by the one thing his soul craved. "How?" Kalen whispered, the sound torn from his throat. "You locked me in a silent room with nothing but my own floor for company," Elian said, his voice soft, but each word a precisely aimed dart. "What did you think I would do? I studied it. I learned. I grew. While you have been unraveling." Kalen's composure broke completely. He reached out, his hand stopping just an inch from Elian's face. His fingers trembled. The desire to touch, to scent, to claim was a palpable force, a gravity pulling them together. He was fighting a war with himself, and he was losing. The scent of ozone was now thick with the smell of desperation. "I did what was necessary," Kalen rasped, his voice thick with a pain that was 5 years old. "For the good of the Corps, for order. You sacrificed me to protect a lie," Elian countered, his voice losing its softness, hardening with the cold fury he had nurtured for so long. "And now the lie is consuming you." He held Kalen's gaze, watching the conflict rage in those glacial eyes. He had the advantage. For the first time in 5 years, he was the one in control. He had exposed the flaw in the flawless machine, and the machine was standing before him, trembling on the verge of collapse. The interrogation was over. The real test had just begun. The escape was not a sudden, violent act, but a quiet, methodical unraveling of the systems that held him. Kalen's visit had been the final catalyst. It had confirmed everything Elian suspected. The Alpha was compromised, his obsession a vulnerability that could be exploited. And Anya, his quiet, kind-eyed medic, had become an unlikely co-conspirator. The data chip had been the first step. The second was a quiet conversation, held in whispers while the infusion pump hummed, its steady beat a countdown to a future Elian was now determined to seize. Anya had been born in the Corps, a product of its sterile conditioning, but she carried a secret sadness. Her younger brother, an Omega like Elian, had been reassigned years ago after failing a conformity assessment. Reassigned was a clean, clinical word for disappeared. She saw in Elian not a dangerous asset, but a reflection of the brother she had lost. Her compliance was not just an act of compassion, it was an act of quiet rebellion, a payment on a debt of grief. She brought him the tools he needed, smuggled in the false bottom of a medical supply case, a multiphasic scrambler to disrupt the camera feed, a chemical solvent that could neutralize the electronic lock on his door for precisely 30 seconds, and most importantly, a detailed schematic of the containment wing's ventilation system. His plan was audacious, relying not on force but on the very sense they had tried to suppress. He would create a ghost. The night he chose was a new moon, a symbolic gesture to a sky he could not see. The sleep cycle lights had dimmed to their lowest setting. The first step was the camera. He activated the scrambler, and the silent black eye in the corner was fed a looped image of him sleeping peacefully on his cot. A digital lie. Next, the lock. He applied the solvent, a clear, odorless gel. The indicator light on the door turned from red to a blinking amber. He had 30 seconds. He did not run. He walked calmly to the small maintenance panel in the corner of his cell, the one Anya had shown him on the schematic. Inside was the intake valve for the air circulation system. This was the most critical part of the plan. He had spent weeks practicing, hoarding a small amount of the nutrients from his meals, allowing them to ferment in a hidden corner of his waste disposal unit. The resulting mash was pungent, organic. He had then carefully infused it with his own essence, bleeding a small amount from his fingertip, letting the unique proteins of his blood mingle with the decay. It was a vile, potent concoction, a perversion of his own scent. He poured it into the intake valve. The system, designed to detect and neutralize any foreign biological agent, would register the scent as a massive, uncontrolled biospill originating from his cell. It would trigger a Level 1 containment protocol. All personnel would be directed away from the source toward designated safe zones, while automated sanitation drones were deployed. It would create a window of chaos. A path. He slipped out of his cell as the lock disengaged, the door sliding open with a soft hiss. The corridor was empty, bathed in the dim blue light of the emergency standby system. He could already hear the first distant alarms beginning to chime. He moved quickly, silently, a grey ghost in a concrete maze. He was not heading for the exits. That would be too predictable. He was heading down, deeper into the substructure of the facility, toward the old service tunnels that Anya's schematic had shown him, forgotten arteries of the city that predated the Corps' sterile reign. As he ran, the air began to change. The recycled antiseptic taste of the containment wing gave way to something else. The cool, damp smell of subterranean rock and dust. The faint, metallic scent of aging machinery. It was the smell of imperfection, of decay, of history. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever smelled. He paused at a junction, pressing his back against the cold concrete wall, his heart hammering. The alarms were louder now, a rhythmic, pulsing beat that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. He heard the distant shouts of security personnel, the heavy tread of their boots moving in the opposite direction toward the ghost he had created. They were hunting a shadow. He allowed himself a moment, closing his eyes, and focused on his senses. He could feel the vibrations in the floor, taste the changing air, but he was searching for something else. He reached out with his unique sensitivity, a blind man feeling his way through a crowded room. He could sense the panic of the guards, a sharp, acrid scent like burnt wiring. He could sense the cold, clinical focus of the facility's warden, a scent like sterile glass. And then he sensed another. Ozone. Powerful, focused, and moving with terrifying speed. But it was not moving toward the alarm. It was moving toward him. Kalen was not following the ghost. He was hunting the man. He had ignored the data, the protocols, the alarms. He was following his instincts. He was following the faint, true trail of Elian's scent that lingered in the air, a trail only he was attuned enough to find. The hunt was on. A new kind of fear, sharp and immediate, pierced through Elian's elation. He had built his plan on the system's predictability. He had not accounted for the Alpha's obsession being powerful enough to override it. He pushed himself off the wall and began to run again, plunging deeper into the darkness, the sound of his own frantic breathing now joined by the echo of a predator in pursuit. The alarm was a shriek in the heart of the citadel, a sound Kalen had not heard within the central command for over a decade. A Level 1 biohazard containment breach. His comm unit crackled with reports. Asset 1138's cell. A massive, unsanctioned scent signature. All personnel evacuating to Sector Gamma. Automated cleanse protocols initiated. Everything was proceeding according to the book. Every instinct in Kalen's body screamed that the book was wrong. He stood before the central command console, a vast holographic map of the facility shimmering in the air before him. The flashing red icon of the breach was in the containment wing. The automated tactical response was routing all security teams to form a perimeter around that wing. It was a logical, disciplined, and utterly flawed response. He knew Elian. He knew the sharp, calculating mind he had seen in those eyes. This was not a chaotic spill. It was a diversion. It was too loud, too obvious. It was a stage magician's flourish, designed to draw the eye while the real trick happened elsewhere. Disregard automated tactical. Kalen's voice cut through the controlled panic of the command center. The officers at their stations turned to look at him, their expressions a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Commander. His second-in-command, a stern-faced beta named Lyra, questioned. The protocol is clear. The protocol is a trap, Kalen stated, his eyes fixed on the holographic map. He closed his eyes for a moment, shutting out the overwhelming data streams, the flashing lights, the noise. He focused on the one sense that had become both his torment and his compass. He pushed past the phantom scent in his own mind and searched for the real one. It was there, faint, elusive, but undeniably real. Rain-soaked earth and freesia. And it was not coming from the containment wing. It was moving downward, toward the old geothermal vents, toward the forgotten underbelly of the city. Seal the upper levels. All security teams redirect to the sublevels. Grid patterns delta through theta. He's heading for the old service tunnels, Kalen commanded. He didn't wait for confirmation. He turned and strode from the command center, his long black coat swirling behind him. His duty was to recapture a fugitive asset. That was the mission. But the mission was a lie. This was not about an asset. This was not about security. This was a primal, undeniable imperative. The hunt. His alpha instincts, so long suppressed and chained by discipline, were roaring to the surface, and for the first time he did not fight them. He let them guide him. He moved through the corridors with a speed and silence that unnerved the few functionaries he passed. He did not take the high-speed lifts. He took a maintenance stairwell, the steps echoing with his heavy, rhythmic tread. The air grew cooler, damper, the polished chrome and white walls of the upper levels giving way to raw concrete and exposed conduits. The scent trail grew stronger here, a delicate thread in the musty air. He was on the right path. The chase was a visceral, consuming thing. It stripped away the layers of his identity, enforcer, commander, architect of order, until only the alpha remained. Every sense was heightened. He could hear the faint scuff of a boot on concrete 50 yards ahead. He could see the subtle disturbance in the thick dust on the floor, a path recently taken. And the scent was a living thing, pulling him forward, a promise and a torment. It was the scent of his mate, a mate who was running from him, and the instinct to pursue, to capture, to corner was overwhelming. He entered a vast, cavernous space, a decommissioned water reclamation plant. Massive, silent turbines stood like sleeping giants, draped in decades of dust and cobwebs. A network of catwalks crisscrossed the darkness above. The scent was strongest here, but it was also fractured, diffused in the enormous space. Elian was trying to mask his trail. He was learning. He was adapting. A flicker of something that felt like pride cut through Kalen's predatory focus. It was a dangerous, unwelcome thought. He stopped in the center of the chamber, standing perfectly still. He let his instincts take over completely. He was not a man hunting another man. He was a predator tracking its prey. He filtered out the scent of rust, of stagnant water, of decay. He focused on the one note that mattered, and he found it. A single, concentrated point of fragrance clinging to a rusted ladder that led up to the catwalks. He had gone up. Kalen launched himself toward the ladder, his powerful legs eating up the distance. He climbed with relentless efficiency, his gloved hands finding sure holds on the cold, rusted metal. When he reached the top, he paused, crouching on the narrow catwalk. The air was different up here. There was a faint breeze. He could smell plants, soil, life. One of the old biodomes, long since abandoned, must be connected to this level. A pocket of chaos in the heart of order. Of course, that's where he would go, a place that smelled of home. He began to run along the catwalk, his boots ringing out on the metal grating. The sound was a declaration. He was no longer trying to be silent. He was announcing his presence. He was herding his prey. He could smell Elian's fear now, a sharp, coppery tang mingling with the floral notes of his scent. It was a scent that both thrilled and agonized him. He was close. The end of the chase was near. He did not know what he would do when he caught him. The commander in his head screamed for containment, for the restoration of order. The alpha in his blood roared for something else entirely, something far more dangerous and far more honest. The air that hit Elian as he pushed through the corroded service hatch was a revelation. It was thick, humid, and alive with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the complex perfume of 1,000 different growing things. After years of sterile, recycled oxygen, it was like diving into an ocean. He stumbled into the space, his eyes struggling to adjust to the dim, green-filtered light. He was in a massive biodome, one of the city's failed pre-core experiments in self-sustaining ecosystems. It had been abandoned for decades, left to run wild. The glass-paneled ceiling, thick with grime and moss, allowed only faint shafts of the city's perpetual twilight to filter through, illuminating a scene of untamed, chaotic beauty. Vines as thick as his arm snaked up skeletal support structures. Massive ferns unfurled in the gloom, and strange pale flowers bloomed in the perpetual damp. It was a jungle thriving in the bones of a laboratory. A perfect metaphor for himself. He leaned against the rough bark of a towering, unidentifiable tree, his lungs burning, his body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. He could hear Kalen, the heavy, rhythmic clang of his boots on the metal catwalks behind him. He was not just pursuing, he was driving him. Elian knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that this was the end of the chase. This was the place of confrontation. He had run as far as he could. Now he had to stand. He pushed himself away from the tree and moved deeper into the biodome, his feet sinking into the soft, damp loam. He found the heart of the space, a small clearing where a pool of brackish water had collected, reflecting the ghostly light from above. He stopped and turned, his back to the pool, and waited. The sounds of pursuit stopped. Silence descended, thick and heavy, broken only by the drip of water from a broad leaf and the hum of unseen insects. Elian controlled his breathing, slowing his frantic heart, centering himself. He was no longer Asset 1138, the fugitive. He was Elian, and he was standing in the first place that had felt like freedom in 5 years. He would not be taken from it easily. Kalen emerged from the shadows of the tree line. He moved with a predator's grace, his black uniform a stark slash of order against the organic chaos of the biodome. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, his glacial grey eyes locking onto Elian. The space between them, no more than 20 feet, felt like a universe, charged with 5 years of silence, pain and a bond that refused to break. The air was thick with their scents, a war of ozone and rain-soaked earth, of control and wildness, of hunter and hunted. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. It was a standoff, but not of weapons. It was a standoff of wills. Kaelin's face was unreadable, the mask of the enforcer back in place. But Ellian could read the truth in his scent. The storm was still there, a hurricane of possessiveness, guilt, and a desperate, agonizing need that was tearing him apart. He was a man balanced on the knife's edge of his own rigid control. "It is over." Kaelin's voice was low, rough, seeming to be physically dragged from his throat. "There is nowhere left to run. I'm not running anymore." Ellian replied, his own voice steady, clear. He was surprised by its strength. Kaelin took a slow step forward, his boot making a soft sound in the damp earth. "You are a fugitive, an escaped asset. By law, I must return you to containment." The words were a formality, a last desperate appeal to the system he had served his entire life. They both knew this was no longer about the law. "Is that what you want, Commander?" Ellian challenged, his voice quiet but carrying in the humid air. "To put me back in that white box? To go back to your sterile world and pretend none of this happened? To pretend you can't smell me right now?" At the mention of his scent, Kaelin flinched, another step forward. The carefully constructed mask of the enforcer began to crack. The torment in his eyes was raw, exposed. "I did what I had to do," he said, the words a hoarse whisper. "You were a threat. Your ability—" "My ability to see the truth," Ellian finished for him. "To smell the rot beneath the pristine surface of your core, to know that the great Enforcer Commander, the pinnacle of Alpha control, was terrified. Is that the flaw you rejected, Kaelin? My ability to see you?" Using his name was like flipping a switch. The last vestiges of the Commander fell away. He was just Kaelin now, an Alpha, broken and desperate, standing before the mate he had tried to destroy. He closed the remaining distance between them in 2 long strides, stopping only when he was inches away. The sheer force of his presence was overwhelming. Ellian had to fight the instinct to flinch, to step back. He held his ground. "Yes," Kaelin breathed, the admission a torrent of agony. His scent flooded the clearing, thick with ozone and self-loathing. "You saw me. You saw it all. The doubt, the weakness, the part of me that hated the cage as much as you did. I couldn't allow that. Control was everything. It was the only thing." His hands came up, not to grab or restrain, but they hovered in the air around Ellian, trembling with the desperate need to touch. His gaze dropped to the pulse point on Ellian's neck, where his scent was strongest. The hunger in his eyes was a physical thing, a black hole of need. "I was wrong," Kaelin whispered, his voice breaking. "For 5 years, I have been living in a ghost story you created. Your scent, it is the only real thing left." He finally gave in. His hand gently, hesitantly, cupped the side of Ellian's neck. His thumb stroked the skin just over the scent gland. The touch was electric, a jolt of pure, unadulterated connection that sent a shockwave through the toxic bond, momentarily cleansing it. Ellian gasped, his knees weakening. Kaelin lowered his head, his face burying in the crook of Ellian's neck. He inhaled. It was not a simple scenting. It was the desperate breath of a drowning man finding air. It was an act of complete and utter surrender. All the control, all the discipline, all the years of repression shattered in that single, ragged breath. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was Ellian. And in the heart of a forgotten jungle, the Alpha who had rejected him was finally, irrevocably, claiming him as his. But the choice, Elian knew, as Kaelin's entire body trembled against his, was no longer Kaelin's to make. It was his. The world narrowed to the point of contact. Kaelin's breath, hot and ragged against his skin. The weight of his hand on his neck, a brand of heat and possession. The overwhelming scent of him, no longer just ozone and desperation, but something deeper, a scent of profound, soul-shaking relief, as if a part of him that had been clenched tight for a lifetime had finally let go. Elian felt the shudder that ran through the Alpha's powerful frame, a tremor that spoke of a foundation collapsing. For a moment, his own anger, the cold, hard fury he had nurtured for 5 years, wavered. The primal Omega instinct to soothe, to accept the surrender of his Alpha, rose like a tide. It would be so easy to give in, to let the bond, raw and exposed, finally take its proper course, to find solace in the arms of the man who was his other half, his genetic destiny. But 5 years in a white box had taught him that destiny was a word used by those in power to justify the cages they built for others. He had not fought his way out of one cage just to willingly walk into another, no matter how gilded it might be. He placed his hands on Kaelin's chest, not to push him away, but to hold him at a distance, to create a space for his own will to exist. Kaelin tensed, a low sound, almost a growl of protest rumbling in his chest. He did not want to be moved. He wanted to sink into Elian, to surround himself with the scent he had been starved of. "Look at me," Elian said, his voice quiet but firm. It was not a request. Slowly, reluctantly, Kaelin lifted his head. His eyes, those once glacial grey eyes, were stormy now, shot through with pain and a terrifying vulnerability. The Enforcer Commander was gone, stripped away, leaving only the man, a man who had broken himself in the name of a system that Elian despised. "This," Elian began, his gaze unflinching, "this changes nothing and everything. You don't get to reject me, break me, and then reclaim me when your own world falls apart. My forgiveness is not a prize for you to win. My life is not a mess for you to put back in order." "I don't expect forgiveness." Kaelin's voice was raw. "I don't deserve it. I need—" He trailed off, unable to articulate the sheer, elemental force of his need. "I know what you need," Elian said, and for the first time, he let the full, unfiltered truth of his ability flow between them. He didn't just speak the words, he let Kaelin feel them through the bond, through the scent he was now consciously projecting. He projected the endless, aching loneliness of his cell, the cold terror of the concordance, the slow, grinding despair, and then the flicker of hope, the hard-won discovery of his own power, the terrifying, exhilarating flight to freedom. He showed Kaelin the world through his eyes. Kaelin staggered back, his hand falling from Elian's neck as if burned. He braced himself against a tree, his breath coming in harsh gasps. To see his own cruelty reflected back with such perfect, empathic clarity was a form of torture his own system had never conceived. It was a punishment and a revelation. "What you need," Elian continued, his voice devoid of pity, but not entirely of understanding, "is to face what you have done, what you have upheld. The core is a lie, Kaelin, a sterile, beautiful, heartless lie, and you were its most perfect soldier." The alarms from the facility above were a distant, muted pulse, a world away. Here, in the green, breathing dark, a different kind of judgment was taking place. "What do you want from me?" Kaelin asked, his voice hollow. "Revenge? Do you want me to turn myself in, to confess my failures? I will do it, whatever you ask." Elian almost laughed. It was a bitter, broken sound. "You still think in terms of punishment and absolution, of rules and command. I don't want your penance. I don't want you to fall on your sword for a system that isn't worth the sacrifice of a single person. I want you to make a choice, not as an enforcer, not as an alpha, but as a man. The world you built is cracking. You can try to hold it together, or you can help me break it." He turned his back on Kalen, a gesture of ultimate trust or ultimate dismissal, and looked out over the dark, tranquil pool. The reflection that looked back was of a stranger, thinner, harder, but with eyes that were finally, truly his own. "I am going to the outer zones," Elian said, his voice resonating in the quiet clearing. "I am going to find others like me, the ones you call flawed, the ones the core has discarded. I am going to build something new, something that doesn't confuse control with peace." He paused, the unspoken offer hanging in the humid air between them. He did not turn to look at Kalen. He did not need to. He could feel the war raging within him, the tectonic shift of a lifetime of belief grinding against a new and terrifying truth. He had given him the choice. Freedom, on Elian's terms, or a return to the gilded cage, alone. The silence stretched, filled with the hum of life all around them. The choice was Kalen's. But Elian's path was set. He took a deep breath of the wild, untamed air. It smelled like home. It smelled like the future. Whatever Kalen chose, Elian was walking into that future. He was finally and completely free.